So that's kind of a quick run on our agenda today. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Joshua Weil. Currently serves as the Assistant Physician-in-Chief for Hospital Operations for Kaiser Permanente Santa Rosa since 2011. Prior to that, he was Chief of the ED from 2001 to 2011. I thought this was an interesting fact, so I thought I would throw it out there. I don't know this guy yet, but I love him. It wasn't until he was 25, sailing across the Atlantic, that he decided to become a physician. Dr. Weil also serves on the American Red Cross Board of Directors and is the medical director for the Jewish Community Free Clinic in Santa Rosa. His interest in disaster and rescue medicine have allowed him to go to Sri Lanka to assist with relief efforts following the tsunami disaster, Baton Rouge, Louisiana following Hurricane Katrina, Haiti following the earthquake, and the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. Did I pronounce that right? Haiyan? This isn't his first time to the Inland Northwest, as in 2007 was his first Ironman triathlon in Coeur d'Alene, which is pretty exciting. So he's been here before, and we're glad to have him back. He is here to share his experience as the incident commander of the evacuation of 130 patients from Kaiser Permanente Santa Rosa in 2017. So with that, I'll turn the microphone over.
Is that a reasonable height for the mic? You guys can hear me great. So thanks so much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks for inviting me up. This crowd looks like my kind of crowd. I only see one tie out there, and the only reason I'm wearing a tie is because now I see two, because I was the presenter. So usually I chose a job where I can wear my pajamas to work most days, and so that's how I'm most comfortable. And but I'm very glad to be here today, and this is informal. You can stop me at any time. The slides that I have today are mostly just a picture show. There's a second slide deck that you guys have access to, I believe, with the link that has the bullet points and the facts and all the numbers and stuff like that. But I don't want to detract that from the story that I have to tell. And I think it's better told when you're not trying to read ahead, because that's what people do, right? You put a slide with bullet points up and people are reading your bullet points before you get to them. So I'm also very informal. You can stop me along the way. And there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. And I have found that there's usually loads of questions, and that's where a lot of the learning comes out. So I'll try to cover what I can. But I'm going to tell you a story. And I guess before I do any talk, I'm always supposed to give disclosures. I have nothing to disclose financially. My only disclosure is that I wish I had taken that picture, but I was working that night. So, and it's true of most of the photos that are on here. They're not my credit. There are a few at the end. So this goes and starts on October 8th, and I am an emergency physician, practicing emergency physician. I'm an administrator, but I spend half my time in the emergency department. I still do night shifts. So Sunday, October 8th was going to be a night shift for me. And my routine is to try and get a couple hours sleep in the afternoon from about, if I can fall asleep between 5 and 6, I can usually stay down for a couple of hours. So Sunday was kind of a quiet day, quieter than many of them are for me. And it was a hot and windy October, and that's not unusual in Northern California at that time of year. It was probably upwards of 100 plus. I know you guys get similar weather around here, but it was windier than usual. But I spent my afternoon, I have a couple goats on my property, and they have a barn shed, and I was trying to fix up their shed. I spent a couple hours doing that. It was exhausting in the heat. And then I actually, you know, Ed had mentioned that I was a triathlete. At one time, I wasn't a two-time Ironman. Now I'm just kind of fat man. And so I actually pulled my bike down, and I said, hey, maybe I should start riding again. I got to get it up back in shape. Pulled my bike down, cleaned it, lubed it, put it on the rollers in we have this little casita kind of pool house, and it was a good place to set that up. Spent a couple of hours doing that, and actually reminiscing through, you know, the casitas where I have old yearbooks, and I actually spent the afternoon looking through. So I spent a lot of time putting in some hours that day that in retrospect were not hours well used, as you'll learn more as I talk about what happened the rest of the night. But anyways, around 6 o'clock, my wife and daughter had actually gone out for the afternoon. I have 3 kids, only one of them still at home. 2 are in college. And I went down for my typical nap around 6, but it was hot and stuffy, and I didn't sleep well. And it didn't occur to me, but the fan had gone off, and I really hadn't thought about it, but the fan was going off because the power kept going on and off. And so I got out of bed at 9, which is a little bit early for me. Usually I try and sleep until around 10, rolling to work a little bit before 11. My shift starts at 11. And my wife was up, and, you know, it was smoky and still quite hot and windy. And so we walked around the property, and we looked around. There's no fire, and there was just smoke. In Northern California in October, forest fires, smoke, it happens. It's just kind of part of living there. And so I really didn't think too much of it. And so since I was up, I went down to work a little bit early at around 10:30. And when I got there, it was smokier than usual. Well, of course, we don't usually have smoke, but it was particularly smoky down at the hospital. And I only live like 3 miles from the hospital. And so there was a lot of smoke, and there was also kind of busy for a Sunday night. Sunday night usually kind of on a reasonably mellow shift, but there was a lot of activity. And I just didn't think too much of it, and that was probably mistake number one, because, you know, we have an instant command center. We can activate the command center and start thinking around these things. And if I had thought about it, hey, there's a lot of smoke here. This is already an issue for the hospital, but I really didn't go there. Right? Ed mentioned all the places that I've gone to respond to disasters, but I never really think about one actually occurring. And of course, the one that I really plan for and think about in Northern California is the earthquake. In fact, I was very well prepared for the earthquake that was going to hit someday. I have a great disaster kit out I had a shed out in the backyard filled with tents and a couple days of food and water purifiers, sleeping bags, dog food, pet food, cash, all that stuff that doesn't do very well in fire, as it turns out. So I was prepared for disaster, but just not the right disaster. And so it really wasn't in my head when I got to work. But there was smoke coming in, and people were starting to complain. Patients upstairs were starting to complain. And so again, probably mistake number two is we probably should have closed down the doors and windows and shelter-in-place type of approach. But again, I was really just thinking, this is just smoke from some distant fire. So I start seeing patients, and like I said, it's getting busier, and I'm starting to see people who are complaining of smoke-related, or a couple people had been responding around either their own properties or their families, and twisted an ankle or sprained a knee or fallen down, facial laceration, these types of things. And but it's still in my mind, this was just going to be a busy night. But meanwhile, the paramedics come through, and every time the paramedics come in, you hear their radios go off. Structure fire here, grass fire there. And one of the paramedics said to me, every fire asset in the county is deployed right now. And that sent a chill down my back, and even when I just said it now, sent a chill down my back again. And so I thought, okay, unusual night. But I was still just kind of plugging along. And around midnight, the photo that's up there right now was my boss, Dr. Kirk Pappas. And the structure for Kaiser is we have health plan leadership and we have medical group leadership. Dr. Pappas was the physician-in-chief. My role is assistant physician-in-chief. There's several of us. We serve at the pleasure of the president. And so Kirk rolled into the hospital a little bit after 12. And this is a photo that he took as he and his wife and son were driving out of their property. That's just a couple miles from me. And which way do we go? That was the kind of situation. We don't know which way to go, left, right, where's the fire going to be? And so around 12:30, Kirk rolled into the emergency department and said, my house just went up in flames. About half an hour later, I'm still seeing patients, and I hear one of the paramedic radios say an address for a structure fire that I figure is a couple miles from my house. So I Google it, and sure enough, it looks like it's 2 or 3 miles from my house. And at 1 a.m., I call my wife, and I say, you know, it's a little bit weird out there. Why don't you get a few things together? Grab the photo albums and the computers and put them in a car. So now I'm going to take you to my wife, and she walks outside, and it's smoky. And she says, okay, I'm going to move a car closer to the house. I'm going to grab the cat carrier. But mistake number one at home, she didn't put the cat in the cat carrier because she thought, I don't want to stress the cat out. It's just a smoky night. And she went inside, and she called a neighbor. And she said, hey, there's some funny stuff going on out there. And the neighbor said, oh, yeah, we got a notification for evacuation. And we're loading up, our neighbors had some horses, and so they're getting the horses in the trailer. Now, we never received anything. So when you guys are thinking about the coalition and the work that you guys do as communities and what your notification systems are like, we probably didn't get a call because we didn't have a landline, right? It's 2017. I never get a call on my landline. I actually have a voice over internet protocol landline, but I don't think it was working because of the power outages. So I never got a call or notification. Of course, very few people in Sonoma County and Santa Rosa did, but a few people did. And so that's something to think about as a community. What do we have for communication systems? I don't know if you guys have Nixle here, which is so I have, you can get it, I think there's a line about it in the PowerPoint. And Nixle is a system that some communities have put out there, and now my phone goes off whenever there's a traffic accident and they're closing a road. But now I get notifications. So now I get notifications. And so those are things that you can have out there. And of course, Sonoma County made decisions that night about whether to even use reverse 911, and they decided not to because they still thought, well, we don't want to panic people. So it's a little after 1, and my wife goes out, still smoky, goes in and gets a cat carrier, talks to the neighbor, hears that, and says, okay, maybe I should get things going. So she goes back outside with the computer and the wedding albums, and now she sees a glow over the hill. And she says, wow, this must be real. And she runs back inside, and she wakes up my daughter, says, grab a bag and your camera, because that's why my daughter's into photography, grab your camera, and let's go. And she grabs one of the dogs, and she walks up, runs outside, and now there's flames, not just a glow. And the fire was moving, driven by 60, 70, 80 mile an hour winds in some areas, up to a football field every minute. So this is a fast moving fire. And she runs back inside and grabs the other dog and comes back out. And now there's flames and fire, things falling out of the sky. And she said the noise was like a jet engine or a train. She said it was, and the fire was like an animal. It was just reaching out and grabbing things, and trees are blowing up and igniting. And she turns to my daughter, my 15-year-old daughter, and says, I got to run back inside and try and find the cat. But the power's out now, and it's dark, and her retinas are orange and red from the fire. And she runs back inside and takes about a minute to try and find the cat, and can't find the cat, and runs back outside. Now, at this time, it's about 1:15, so 15 minutes after I called her, where it was just smoky, and now the house is basically engulfed in flames. And my phone goes off, and it's my other neighbor, Mike, who says, he's just yelling at me, Josh, you got to get out of the house. He doesn't realize I'm at work. And I'm literally in a room with a patient reviewing her Xray, telling her that I don't see a fracture and that she probably just sprained her ankle. Turns out I missed a fracture in her foot, but I guess I wasn't examining her that tightly. And she wrote something on Facebook, said that was really great. I don't know why she thought that. I missed a fracture, but anyways, she kind of knew what was going on. So I excused myself, ran out of the room, and said, Mike, I got to go. I got to call my house. And I call my wife's cell phone, and I'm saying, get out, get out. And my daughter answers, and she's just screaming. That's all I hear is screaming. And that was a pretty bad 45 to 60 seconds. I can kind of hear my wife in the background saying, we're going to be okay, we're going to be okay. And I'm trying to talk my daughter down. Just breathe, you're going to be okay. And my wife is driving over, burning branches. She can't really see because of the smoke, but the fire is on either side of the road. So she's just kind of driving down the path where there's road and not fire. And they get to the bottom of the hill, and she says it's Armageddon. Because we live up on the hill, there's 3 houses on our drive, and then down the bottom are about 600 houses, and pretty tightly packed. It's a neighborhood that was built in the 1970s. I had a 1970s ranch-style house. I'm in the middle of a remodel. I was always going to remodel, but it wasn't going to be from the dirt up, but now I get to do that. So so this is a kind of a lot of older houses, probably not up to current codes, well, definitely not up to current codes. And she said the police and fire are there, and they're just pulling people out of the house, and people are running out in their underwear, and they're just throwing things in the cars, and it's Armageddon. And so I said, just get to the hospital. Just get to the hospital. And so they show up a few minutes later, and the first thing my wife says is, we're alive, so she gets in. And at this time, things are really starting to pick up. But in my mind, this is a surge event, right? I heard you guys drilled evacuation yesterday, sort of. but primarily it was as a surge event. So I've been an emergency physician for 20 years. I've responded all over the world. I'm involved in disaster preparedness for our hospital. We almost always do surge events, right? Whether it's shooter, earthquake, influenza pandemic. That's what we always do. Now, I think probably twice in 20 years we've drilled evacuation, and we pulled out a piece of paper and put it on a stair chair and took the stair chair down the stairs. Maybe 2 people saw how to actually unfold the chair. But what we do is we drill surge. That's what we always think. So in my mind, right, here's another one of my mistakes. In my mind, I'm still thinking surge. And around this time, one of my other bosses, so remember I said there's health plan leadership and then there's medical group. So Judy Coffey calls me and she says, Josh, what's going on? I'm getting calls from the staff up on the floor. And I said, Judy, I think it's time we open up the command center. And Judy's house was in the fire zone. She wasn't yet in fire, but about 15 minutes later, she loses her house. So around 2 a.m., Judy comes in, Kirk is there. I've spoken to some of my other colleagues. We're actually bringing in more physicians and nurses. And again, we're thinking surge event. And we open up the command center. And around that time, Kirk Pappas, my boss, pulls me in and says, Josh, time to stop seeing patients. You're going to be incident commander. And again, it's just kind of who's there and my experience. And I've drilled it. I've sat in that chair. I put on the vest a time or two, but not when it was really happening. So things really kind of sped up from there. And by now, fire and police are on scene. Law enforcement is on scene. We're getting a surge of patients. This is, outside the hospital. There's lots of smoke. The hospital is inundated with smoke now. We're getting complaints from patients. There are patients who are looking out the windows and saying, what's going on here? What are we going to do? So fire's on scene, and I start having conversations with the fire incident command, and they're still recommending shelter in place at this point. And so that's, again, our mindset. We're surge, we're shelter in place. But I did start saying to people, who's in the hospital right now? But what I'm really thinking about is who are the patients that are in the hospital. And so we started doing that. Who are our patients in the hospital right now? Now, we use Epic. We call it Health Connect, but it's Epic, which I know many of you guys are on an EMR, probably everybody by now, and whether it's Epic or one of the other systems. And they have in them the ability to kind of give you a list of who you have and print out a 2-page, this is their problem list, this is the medications that they're on. But we made a decision in our hospital that we don't have, the people who primarily know how to do that are in admitting. And at night, we don't have admitting. Oops, mistake number, I don't know what I'm up to, 3, 4, 5 by now. So we didn't have that ability. But I did send a couple of doctors to start thinking about who we have in the hospital. But here's another thing that I didn't really think about. Who we have in the hospital is not just the patients, of course, but it's who's all the staff. Who's down in the cafeteria? Who's in medical imaging? Who's manning the phones? How many people are on for EVS or security? I don't know. I work in the hospital all the time. I can't tell you who's on in the middle of the night. So who's minding those people? And one of the feedback that came to me was around communication. So at this point, I'm still in my mind. It's a surge event. And so I'm not thinking that I have anything necessarily to communicate. But in retrospect, a lot of people were asking, how come we weren't being kept up to date? And I'm not sure what the message was that I was supposed to send. We're okay. Don't rearrange the deck chairs yet. But probably if I had just sent out some kind of message, we know what's going on, we have the teams in place, we're working the problem, that probably would have been enough to at least allay some of those concerns that people had. So in retrospect, that's a mistake. Now I'm up to 6 or 7. That's something I would do differently, is how I would communicate into the hospital, but also to think about how I'm going to make sure that I know who's behind those closed doors, right? Because the operators and the lab people, they're behind closed doors. And I don't know who's in there right now. And so that's an important people to know. The next thing that happened was, again, the fire was still advising shelter in place, but now that's fire. Let's see what my next image is. So that's from the parking structure, and there's the hospital. By the way, 173-bed hospital, 34-bed ED, roughly 65,000 ED visits, We're about 160 deliveries a month. So we're a moderate-sized hospital. I work in the Kaiser system. We're really good at keeping people out of the hospital. So our admit rate's only around 13, 14%. But that's not for lack of acuity necessarily. It's just that we have systems in place. We can manage a lot of people as outpatients. It hadn't been very many days before that we actually had a hospital census around 140. We were a little bit lucky that night that we had a hospital census in the high 90s plus ED patients. So in the end, it was about 125 to 24 patients. But we got a little bit lucky. So we're kind of looking at that, and we're thinking where we're going to go. And at around 3 a.m., the fire guys came through, and they said, and I remember these words, "We're making a last stand. We're making a last stand." So to the north here is a trailer park. And most of the trailer park by now has burned through. And there's 2 rows of trailers left, and there's a dry creek bed that runs between the hospital and the trailer park. And they said, "We're making a last stand. We're going to use that creek and those last row of trailers, and we're going to try and hold off the fire." And that was probably the first time I really felt scared. I thought, this is really coming. And it was also when I said, "Okay, time to evacuate the hospital." And they said, "We're not advising that. We're advising shelter in place." And I said, "Time to evacuate the hospital." And in my mind, I said, "Oh, crap, I'm going to get in so much trouble for this." Because we have a regional system set up, right? 21 hospitals. Right now, Regional Command Center is standing up. And I'm just, the APIC, and I'm just an emergency physician. But I felt like, okay, this is my responsibility, and I don't want to try to evacuate the hospital when the fire jumps that line and the last stand is over. Now, these guys, the firefighters, were amazing that night. And I'll just say it here now, what was going on was unprecedented. There have been concerns that have been raised about whether the communication should have gone out earlier, where the fire guy should have held off a line, whether we should have fire breaks. So I don't know how many of you know about the way the fire spread, but first I'll say this. We had a fire in 1960-something, about 50 years ago, that if you look at it, you can look it up in the New York Times, they have it, and if you overlay the map of that fire versus the Tubbs fire in October, if it were in court, you could admit it as a fingerprint. I mean, they're incredibly similar. The difference is that fire moved the 19 miles from Calistoga to Santa Rosa in 5 days. This one moved in 5 hours. It's unprecedented. Nobody had any context to make these decisions. We were making all kinds of decisions that night. And all I can say is that there were no wrong or right decisions. They were just decisions, right? I had to make a decision in that moment. I don't know if it was wrong or right. 3 hours later, I was vindicated. It was the right decision, right? Because now we're in an evacuation zone and we don't have any power and we don't have any water or medical gases. So in retrospect, it was easy. But at that moment, to evacuate 120 people with varying degrees of medical acuity, you're putting them all at risk. And so that was a hard decision to make. And I felt alone, even though I had a ton of support. I mean, I looked at Kirk and I looked at you and I said, "We're evacuating." And they said, "Yes." But I felt kind of alone. And fortunately, nothing untoward happened. But people worked incredibly hard. Keep in mind, at this time, I have, in addition to the 120 patients, I have about 50, 60 staff. Many of them are like me. They don't know if their homes are burned. I'm pretty sure my home's gone, but my wife and daughter left before it actually was up in smoke. But there were people who knew that their homes were either burning down or were trying to get a hold of their own family members. I had a couple docs from the emergency department that were finishing up their shifts, and when they saw me yelling at my daughter, they were, "I'm out of here. I got to go home and see one of my colleagues." She knew her husband and her kids were up on the hill, and she had to go up and see if they were getting out of there. So everybody is operating in this milieu of what are we going to do and how's it going to go from here. But people were incredible. So I say time to evacuate. Law enforcement and the county are on scene. They have county buses there. We start initiating contact with the ambulance companies. And we get 20 rigs on scene. And people start coming up to me with all these ideas. One of my seasoned emergency nurses who's done a lot of training for disaster says, "Hey, I was just at a conference and they talked about using private vehicles." Great idea, John. Let's get some. And a couple of the doctors and nurses were like, I volunteer to get the hell out of here. I'll take some patients. So we were putting patients in cars. We had one of our nurse managers from L&D, and we had a couple of moms. Fortunately, no one in active labor, but they were up on the unit. Put them in the car, started driving down towards some of our other hospitals where we have labor and delivery. So now some of the conversations start coming up with the county. We have these buses. This is our county assets. The county is standing up evacuation centers. We have a veterans hall, and they were going to set up a shelter there. And so they wanted to take those buses and 80 patients to the shelter. And I said, these are not evacuees. These are hospital patients. By the way, this is the Journey's End, the aptly named Journey's End, which is the trailer park just to the north of us. That's how it looked around that time. So we started having a conversation about whether the county could let go of these assets across the county lines to take my patients to a hospital, which is where I wanted them to go. I had a sister hospital about 35, 40 minutes south of us in San Rafael, and I felt like that was the best place to take hospital patients. Anyone with high acuity, I was going to put across town to one of our other hospitals in town. There's 3 hospitals in town, Sutter, Memorial, and Kaiser. Sutter's already evacuated about half an hour before us, maybe an hour. And Sutter, of course, and Memorial, of course, is getting inundated with all the trauma and all that's going on. So I don't want to overburden them with obviously the high acuity patients. I've got to get over there, but all those intermediate acuity, I feel like we can get to some of our sister hospitals. So this is a conversation that is going on. Now, in the background, we're starting to move people down to the evacuation point. And I think typically what you're taught, right, is you think about horizontal evacuation and then vertical evacuation. We did kind of simultaneous. Let's just get everyone going. And we did it like you would when you have a surge. Who can walk? Walk on down. Who is okay to go in a wheelchair? Got a wheelchair. Who is on a vent? I'm going to push that person down in a bed. But we did it kind of all simultaneously. And I also made a decision at this point. We had already switched over to generator power. And so I said, well, okay to use the elevators. And I was a little bit of a risk. But like I said, how many of us had trained using stair chairs or sleds? And the answer is pretty close to 0. And so to think about what we would have tried to do to get those people down in stair chairs would have been, I think, would have added to the risk for people and also for staff. So we made that decision. So now we're lining up patients in the halls. And I think I have by the way, this is the view from some of the hospital floors. So patients are looking out the window and going, what's going on? Can I go home? Can I be discharged? So I know I said I wanted to stay 2 more days, but I want to be discharged. So that's now there's fire on scene. This is how things are lining up there. Again, the view from the window. So pretty impressive. So we started moving people down on the first floor. We had the buses lined up. And another astute staff member came up to me and said, hey, Josh, what do you think about putting a staff member by every patient just to kind of keep an eye on them? Great idea. Not necessarily a nurse or a doc or even a tech. EVS. Stand next to these 2 patients. If anyone gets in trouble, raise your hand and let me know. So med imaging techs, EVS, cafeteria people, we put them all to work. We put them staging as we stage the patients there. A brilliant idea. So really helped kind of keep an eye on people. And there was 1 or 2 patients who started getting under a little duress, and we were able to respond to them because we knew right away. So I know you can't recognize any of these people because they got a little black across their eyes, right? So nobody can recognize anybody in that photo just because of that black. So that is our hospital lobby. That's our hospital lobby, and we're lining everyone up in there. Now here's another mistake. And I was just talking to Casey and a couple of the people who gave me a ride over here about what you guys did yesterday. I got all these patients in here. Who's on isolation? I don't know. We didn't really think about it. We didn't really think about isolation. In retrospect, that's one of the things we're talking about now is how do we work isolation the next time. So again, we are putting people by acuity to think who we're going to get on the buses. But we have these great carts for surge, right? When we have a surge event, we're going to roll the carts out. We have IV equipment and bandaging and splint material and chest tubes, and we're ready to roll out on the tarmac. We'll take care of you out there. I don't have anything ready to go on the bus. I don't have go packs. So we put the patients on the bus and we put them on with nurses. And we had med control via phone, but we didn't put we didn't put a doctor on the bus. So that's another thing I would do differently next time is I would put teams of caregivers on board because we had one patient who started seizing and, the doctor was able to give some direction. But I think it was a tense moment for people. We also had one of those cars going down in the private vehicle with one of my docs. And I was talking with someone else here today about kind of the patients that we house in our emergency departments, right? This is 2017, where we all board patients, right? We have those social placements that spend 2-3 days in the emergency department. Well, some of those were now in private vehicles. And one was with advanced dementia. I guess it was a little comical down. But meanwhile, there was another patient in the car who started getting some shortness of breath. And unfortunately, one of the other patients had oxygen, so the doc put some oxygen on. Now, keep in mind, there's now in the community, like I said, so typically a 30-minute drive down to this other hospital, maybe 40. It's taking 2.5 hours because everybody was trying to get out of Santa Rosa. So this person starts complaining of shortness of breath. And when they got down to San Rafael, she was having a STEMI. So, but I think unfortunately didn't have an untoward outcome. But so there's a little tense moments there. These are some of the things you have to deal with. So that's something I would think about for your systems is what do we have in terms of go bags that are ready to go, whether it's, pharmaceuticals, you're gonna have to work with pharmacy, but certainly equipment to go on a bus because you're not gonna get everybody in the back of an ambulance. The other thing we faced here was tracking. So again, we have some of these tracking tags, but they're upstairs and nobody had time to go grab them. And again, those are you're really just thinking about surge. So one of my colleagues came up with a great idea. I put mine down here, but we all have cell phones. They all have cameras on them. So I'm going to take a picture of someone's name badge. I'm going to take a picture of their face, and I'm going to put them in the bus, and we're going to reconcile later where they showed up. And it worked. It worked. Everybody, as they went out the door, just take a picture of their name band, and that was a great way to track. So don't forget the technology that you have in your pocket. It's really helpful in those kinds of situations. So we start moving people down, and about half an hour later, I get notified that one of the bus drivers apparently panicked and decided he wasn't going to drive down to Kaiser San Rafael, but he was going to drive to the Veterans Hall where there's no medical staff. And now he's dropping off, like 30 patients there. So now we've got to scramble. I still have a teams in the hospital, and we put together a doc and 2 nurses and some equipment. We say, drive down to the Veterans Hall and set up camp there, and we'll work on getting you transport, which we were able to do over the next couple of hours. So by 6:30, 3 hours later, we had evacuated 123 people safely without any bad outcomes. And really, it was just a lot of luck, but really amazing effort by people. I think some of the key points are, again, I'm an emergency physician, and so I don't feel very strongly about hierarchy. So when I said people come up to me and said, Josh, they really are saying to me, Josh. I mean, some people go, hey, Dr. Weil, but mostly it's a kind of a flat hierarchy in my mind. And I think that really helped in that situation that people felt comfortable coming up to me and saying, hey, I've got an idea. Are you willing to listen? Hell yeah, I'm willing to listen. I've not been through this before. So that really helped kind of lay that opportunity for people to work together as teams. But I also think that the way people responded was remarkable. You just don't know how you're going to respond to a situation like this until it happens, right? I have been to these scenes, but it wasn't my backyard, and it wasn't in the moment. And what I liken it to is that when I was in college, yes, I have an affinity for the sea, and I spent a month at a marine lab in Jamaica, and I was working in the marine lab, and we would go out on dives, and we were doing some study areas, and so you laid down we're about 60 feet and laying down some transect lines, so you make grids so you can survey the grids. And we didn't want to stir up the bottom, so I'm there with my dive buddy. I take off my fins, and we're putting down the line. I'm kind of paying attention to my air, but not very well, obviously, which is not good for diving. But and I go, hey, I'm down to 500 pounds of air. So do we need to go back up? No, I think I'm okay. Now I'm down to 300 pounds. Okay, maybe it's time we go pull on our fins. Oh, now my gauge says 0. Do you need air? No, I'm okay. Yes, I need air. So 60 feet, I'm just pulling my fins back on. And this is in the days before. Now everybody has an octopus, which is a second regulator. It's really easy to buddy breathe. But back then it was like you buddy breathe. You take a breath, pass the regulator off to your buddy, make sure you exhale so you don't blow up your lungs as you're going up, a nice controlled descent. get to the top, start laughing. Laughing because things could have gone wrong. I didn't know how I would respond until that happened, but it happened and I handled it, and now I knew I was a better diver. So I look at that night and I say, we're all better for it. I wouldn't wish anybody to go through that, but as a team, we're much better and stronger because we know we can rely on each other in ways that we never knew before. And that's a very powerful lesson to be learned. So these are some of I mentioned John Baker. He's standing off on the screen right, I guess. He's that nurse who came up to me. We have other doctors and staff in there, but we're in the hallway. Now, some things to think about are communication. So at this point, I have 6:30 in the morning, I have people who are now wondering, can I get to the hospital? All kinds of road closures. Am I needed in the hospital? Are we needed in the clinics? On our campus, we run two clinic buildings in addition to the hospital. And then a mile north, we have 2 more clinic buildings and an outpatient surgery center. So people are now wondering what's needed and what are you going to use for communication? So turns out social media is very good these days for communicating. You also can use the regular media, right? We have public relations people and we put them in touch with radio and news. But sometimes we found that the message got mixed up. And so you have to really be careful how you control the message. And in some ways, it's easier to do through social media. We established regular phone calls, check-ins that people could call in. And we could say, okay, here's what the plan is right now. Here's what we're aiming for this afternoon. Here's what we're aiming for later on today. Here's when the next check-in call is. So that became a very important way of communicating. And I would think about that kind of structure as you go forward. Of course, all of our, this is kind of the morning after, and now things start to sink in. And there's a lot of concerns for how we're going to handle the hospital. We're inside an evacuation zone, but we still serve a community. Our patient population is roughly 170,000 people. Santa Rosa's 300,000, the greater Sonoma area is about the same as Spokane, as I gather, 500, 600,000 people. But our service population for our hospital and our clinics is about 170,000 people. So now we have to start thinking about how we're going to get this hospital back up and running. How are we going to get the clinics up and running? How are we going to get patients their pharmaceuticals, right? Because people flood their houses. And by the way, this is not over yet. This is one of the things that the first time I really got angry was probably on day 2 or day 3, because the fire, they'd start to look like we're going to get a little bit under control. The winds would shift, and the winds would roll back to their direction, and the fire would come back. And they kept re-evacuating people. I had friends who were evacuated 2, 3 times, and some said, I'm not sure which is worse, losing your house or being evacuated. And I said, I'm pretty clear on which is worse. So, but it is stressful to people to have to go through that. And then as a hospital, we kept saying, are we in or out of the evacuation zones? We have to work with the county to be able to be back out of the evacuation zone. They actually cut a slice of the evacuation zone to say, okay, you guys can be back up and running. I had mentioned that our medical gases were off, our electricity, we had to work to get those things back up and running. We made a decision, and again, decisions right or wrong, I don't know, they're just decisions. We made a decision to take basically every piece of equipment out of the hospital and restock the entire hospital. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever opened a hospital, but it takes months to stock a hospital. So we did it in 2 weeks. But we made that decision. And so what I think I would advise is we were kind of making that decision off the cuff. You know, how much heat and smoke compromises sterilized equipment, medications, machinery. And if you don't have a clear understanding of that before an event like this occurs, then you're going to have to try and make it in the moment. And it's not an easy decision to make. And we made decisions about our HVAC system that was a little bit older than one of our systems. The neighbor hospital I mentioned, Sutter was a much newer facility. They opened up more quickly because they made some different decisions about their HVAC systems and about their equipment. I don't know which decisions are right or wrong. I just know they were decisions. But I think it would be helpful if you consider those things ahead of time to say, what compromises this equipment such that it would not be usable in the future? And that would help you to get things back up and running. But by the way, what do you have in stock? You know, and where is it going to come from? What are the supply lines? What can you replace in a day or in 12 hours? What takes 10 days to get from someplace else? And where's the nearest backup for that? So those are the kinds of information that if you have that ahead of time, it's going to really help you when you try to reopen. A couple comments about staff and supporting supporting people. Our organization, I feel, did a really good job of supporting people. Obviously, there's a lot of trauma involved, psychological trauma. People respond differently. Some people couldn't come back to work. Some people, like myself, just kind of need to be at work, right? But we had our teams were set up, and for 2+ weeks, 17 days, we were kind of operating 15, 16, 18 hours a day in that mode of trying to get the hospital back up and running. And that's not always good for your health. But we had psych people, and they would pull me out of the room and say, time to take a break, Josh. You got to take some break. And by the way, you got to talk to me, even though you don't think you need to, but you need to. And guess what? I start crying because there's a lot going on there. And I lost pets, and I lost my house, and I lost my history. And at some point, you have to deal with that. So it's really important to recognize that and to support that, whatever your organization can do. People want to help. People donated time and money so that people who were affected. We lost 210 nurses, staff, physicians lost their homes in this fire. 210. We employ about 3,500 people, I think. So that's a little less than 10%. And how about schools? So my daughter's school was closed down for several days, and about 10% of her classmates lost their homes too. And I thought it was really, they did a critical stress debrief event at her school, and there was a really astute upperclassman who said, in a couple of weeks, life's going to go back to normal, more or less, for most people. What I need is for people to remember that my life's not going to go back to normal for a long time. And to recognize that, and to recognize that there's ongoing issues. And again, I think our organization has been pretty good about this. So I was talking to some people earlier today. In the first couple months, I just worked. I didn't need time off. I had things to do, and I didn't have a lot of things that were drawing me elsewhere. We moved 4 times in the first 3 months. That was a hassle. But I didn't have very much to move, so it wasn't that hard. It was stressful on our pets. We actually we lost a cat that night, a chicken, which I wasn't very attached to, a couple boa constrictors, which I, more or less attached to, a fish or 2. But we got out with our 2 dogs. My wife and my daughter were scheduled to go up to Portland because that's where my son's in school. And I said, you should just go. There's nothing for you to do here. You need to go. This is the weekend right after, right? So fire Sunday night into Monday. And my wife and my daughter went down to my in-laws. They live a couple hours away. And then I said, you just go up to see Caleb. But my wife said, well, I can't leave the dogs. I can't leave the dogs. I can't, if you're at work and something happens and the fire comes back, I can't leave the dogs. So people, and anybody who's been through disasters know that how attached they are and how important pets are to people. And so really thinking through, again, as a community, what you do in shelters, you guys have probably thought this through, I would think, but as a shelter is set up, what are you going to do for people's pets? When I was in Louisiana after Katrina, that was one of the biggest struggles for us, was that we had people that we wanted to bring in for healthcare and for sheltering, and they had a dog or cat with them that they would not leave. They would not leave, and so they refused the care and the help that they needed because they didn't have a place to go with that pet. So really important when you think about how you're going to set that up, how you're going to shelter those pets in addition. Sonoma County, I would imagine, like here, it's not just dogs and cats, it's horses, it's goats, it's those other things. By the way, my wife looked at the goats as she drove off. But there was, this is kind of some of the neighborhoods. This is a little bit the other side of me, but this is what you saw. So when I'm driving around the day or 2 after, this is what you see. And it looks like a bomb is dropped, right? I mean, there's kind of bombed out shell of a car. Mailboxes survived. I told my architect, build me a mailbox. I don't know why mailboxes survived, just make it a big mailbox. Because when you drive around these neighborhoods, that's what you would see is these. But now in my neighborhood, I mentioned three houses on the hill, 600 houses or so down below us. And every single one of them absolutely obliterated, except my neighbor Bob, who's below me. And I don't know why Bob's house, he had a cord of wood stacked up against his house, for God's sake. He has wood siding. But I think the fire just came down. We have these oak trees, and he's kind of tucked up against the side of the hill. And I think the fire came down, and it just flew over his house, and his barn blew up and went down. But his house did not. I think Bob's a little bummed because right now, there are going to be 600 or 700 new modern homes that are going up, and Bob's going to be stuck with his 1970s house. So I try to go up to my house the day after the fire. So Sunday night into Monday. Monday at around 5, I finally decided to try and take a break from the hospital and drive up and see. I didn't know for sure if my house was there or not. And but I was driving along, and everything is just, like a war zone. You're driving through it; it looks like a war zone. And I couldn't make it because there were some down power lines, and I wasn't sure if they were live or not. And I thought, I'm not going to try and drive over those. So I went back to the hospital. So the next day, I called my friend Marcus, who's in law enforcement. And by now, because now they're putting up roadblocks. But between his badge and my badge, I figure we can probably get by the roadblocks. And we do. And I'm driving up the hill, and like I said, everything's obliterated. But first, I see my neighbor Bob's house. I go, hey, Bob's house is there. Maybe somehow, by some miracle, my house is okay. And I could drive around a curve, and we come up, and I see my house, which looked like those. Well, you can see it in the background, and it's just obliterated. And I'm walking around, and I'm tearful, and I'm calling for the cat, and I hear, and there are my goats. So Lucy and Ethel. So Lucy's the redhead, and Ethel is the brunette there, and that's not burned. They were singed, but that's just her natural markings. But somehow they survive. I mean, I don't know how they do this. There's all these great stories. If you Google Josh Weil fire goats, there's actually an NPR story about my goats, as well as another group of goats and a dog, like a Pyrenees herding dog that stayed with his goats and kept them through the fire. The only thing I can think is that, they had mowed down the grass in their pasture pretty low, and I think there was nothing to sustain the fire, and it just kind of blew over them. And then their fence burned down, and they went, hey, I have some grapes on my property. They go, hey, we've been eyeing those grapes for a long time. Now it's free for all. So between the grapes and some water there, they were still there. Now they live in the East Bay down with some friends until we rebuild. So that is pretty much my slides and my story, and I'm happy to entertain lots of questions. So the first question was about medical records, how we handle medical records, and then the second part was how we handled people approaching the hospital, families looking for care, and communicating with the community that we serve medically. So the first part is easy. Epic is, it's housed on servers in multiple places, none of which are actually in the hospital. So if you're on an EMR, it's probably should be kept on at least a couple different servers. We have a server in California. I think we have a server in Southern California, and we have another one in Maryland. So Kaiser's a big system, 4 million plus in Northern California, 13 million people nationally. So we house our information on a couple different servers, and they get backed up. But one of the challenges was that as there was this surge of patients arriving at Kaiser San Rafael, by the way, they went, the numbers are in the slide deck, but they're a relatively sleepy ED. I think they see 25,000 patients a year, maybe 30. So easily half of what we see. Their hospital typically is about half the capacity that we have. They don't have labor and delivery. They were suddenly surged with, some 80 patients. And I talked to one of my colleagues, hospitalist there, who is, she's the APIC for hospital, and she said she got the call around 3:30, hey, Santa Rosa's sending you patients. And she said, okay, how many? And they said, all of them. So, they doubled their hospital, in a matter of hours. They doubled or tripled their emergency department. And not only that, but, not only the patients that were in the ED that we transferred down there, but all the ones that now were seeking Kaiser emergency care that had driven down, that had evacuated. I should also mention, too, that just before I finish up on the point, that thinking about what stress does to people, there are people who left our hospital who no longer work there who said, either they felt let down by what happened, or they just felt like they didn't feel safe in the community anymore, or things were on edge and now they didn't have any reason to stay. And that happens in personal relationships. I know of two of my colleagues who are getting divorced. It's not to say that a fire caused them to get divorced. Obviously, there's something that was going on underlying that, but things change. And now, like everything you had together, maybe your house, everything is, and your history and your photos and all that stuff is gone. So it really is a deep impact. And I want to make sure I emphasize that. But so your second part of the question is, what do we do to let people know where to get care? And that was a huge, huge effort. So, right, we had to, first of all, I mean, law enforcement's not going to let anyone come on campus. We're in an evacuation zone, so they're blocking it off and they're redirecting people. But we had to communicate people where you're going to get your care. Well, we happen to have a clinic in Roner Park, just clinic-built facilities, which is about 15 minutes to the south of us, 10 miles or so. And so we were directing people there for urgent care walk-ins. And we set up expanded pharmacy operations there so that we could get people their medications. We communicated through social media, through phone calls, through radio, through newspaper to kind of get that word out to people. Labor and delivery was a huge thing. So we had to set up L&D nurses around the clock, kind of guiding people on the phone, redirecting to some of our other hospitals. Now, San Rafael, which is closest facility, doesn't have labor and delivery. So we had to direct people to San Francisco or to Vallejo. So again, a lot of use of, we're fortunate already that we have, since we're such a big system, that we have a call triaging system. I mean, as an emergency physician, I get frustrated. I'm like, really? They didn't ask you if you've just been throwing a softball and that's why you have arm, shoulder pain, you're not having a heart attack? But you know, that's, you know, for the most part, they handle literally hundreds of thousands of calls a day. They do a great job. And so we just expanded that capability of what they could do to take in those calls, to field triage people, and then direct them to the clinics. And then as we were able, we started opening up more clinic space on our campus and on our buildings to the north. So it was really a very integrated approach to making sure that people notify them, sending out messages, you know, phone blasting people through our system, letting them know what was available. Good questions.
And how did you handle the families of your patients? How did you notify them?
Right. So the question for those on the online is, how do we notify the families of patients and who had been transferred or had been moved to their hospital? And it took us a little while because we had to first figure out exactly where we sent everybody, had to reconcile where we had people. And then we were able, a lot of times we're getting the calls in. So we kind of centralized those calls in, just like you would in a situation where you're trying to say who's where. And again, with our medical record, an electronic medical record, we're pretty easily able to know where people are on the system. The challenging is if they've gone to one of our non-Kaiser hospitals like Santa Rosa Memorial. But again, once we're able to reconcile that list, we're able to direct people to that. Now, one thing that I should say about the EMR, and I don't know if you guys have, I think you have a couple hospitals that have multiple hospital systems, probably in the same EMR. Well, it turns out that you have to discharge the patient from one hospital before they can be admitted to the new hospital, right? So all these patients are at Kaiser Santa Rosa. Their records are available at Kaiser San Rafael, but they can't be admitted to that hospital until they are discharged from Santa Rosa. So we spent the better part of that Monday discharging all those patients and trying to reconcile those records. So.
What system, or how did you communicate with the other hospitals regarding their capacity to receive the patients? Who could receive surge patients?
Right. So the question is about how we communicate with other hospitals to know who had capacity to accept our patients. And it's just like any surge event. You know, again, I'm fortunate to work in a 21 hospital system, 4 million patients. I had mentioned that we had already stood up our regional command center, so they were really coordinating that. And so by this time, we have all the hospitals are opening up their command centers, looking at what their capacity is. We made a decision early on to just say, I get these patients to the closest facility, and that's San Rafael, and then we'll worry from there where we can send them afterwards. So the initial response was just, let's get them the heck out of here and to the closest place, but then afterwards we'll work on that capacity. That's the other thing to say, is that it took a lot of effort to think about how we were going to coordinate not just the patients who has capacity, but what kind of staffing capacity, physicians, operating rooms, pharmacy, techs. And so the good news is that I now had a hospital worth of staff that largely was available. You know, there's 10% of us or so that were dealing with the immediate crisis and our own situations. But for a lot of other people, they want to work, they want to help. So we sent our doctors down to San Rafael to help the staffing there because they were seeing this huge surge. We sent our hospitalists to San Rafael, who are mostly managing Kaiser Santa Rosa patients at Kaiser San Rafael. So we put our hospitalists down there to work them. We sent surgeons to work in the operating rooms and staff, radiology staff, and ultrasonographers and MRI techs to kind of help out that staffing. And again, as a 21 hospital system, we were able to leverage those personnel to work in those places where we had surge. And it makes people feel good to be involved in helping them to move things forward, right? People don't want to, that's kind of the worst part where you're sitting around twiddling your thumbs and thinking, how can I help? I want to do something.
When you made the decision to evacuate, did you talk about what that vital piece was, and did your hospital suffer any damage? Too much smoke, did you have to scrub all the HVAC system?
So the question is about the final decision to evacuate, and how much damage was done and what really kind of led to that decision. I think for me the biggest part was timing. You know, I had never actually evacuated a hospital before, and so I felt like I wanted to do it under as little duress as possible. And the thought of that fire jumping the line and putting me in I have 30 minutes to evacuate the hospital situation was just not tenable. And as I said, in retrospect, it was easy because we lost medical gases, we lost power, we lost sewage. And so by 6:30 or 7 in the morning, the hospital was not functional as a hospital anyway. So in retrospect, it was clearly the right decision. But at that moment, it was just that we were on generator power. And so in theory, we could have tried to continue to shelter in place. But beyond the loss of the medical gases, we did have a tremendous amount of smoke inundation. And again, we weren't quite sure about the safety of the equipment, pharmaceuticals, sterile process equipment. And so that's a lot of what we had to go through in the aftermath. We did decide to scrub the HVAC system in a way that was different than the newer hospital down the road had chosen. They did a much more superficial cleaning of their system, but their system was newer, and so they felt that it wasn't going to be stressed the way that we felt ours would be. There was mostly smoke, some heat because we lost our cooling, and it was close to 100 degrees that night. Just the prevailing temperatures, and so so we set up portable HVAC systems and fans and doing a lot of cleaning. And we did hear from staff who were concerned about the safety of working in that environment as we were cleaning and restocking. And there was particulate matter in the air, but it was much less in the hospital than it was outside, right? So I showed you some of those pictures of what it looked like out there. And there was a lot of particulate matter. We were handing out masks. I don't know what the damage to my lungs is going to be. I don't like wearing a mask, and and so I tended to walk around without one. And the N95s, you're really supposed to be fit tested before you use an N95, so it's not really appropriate to hand people, but people were walking around with them anyways. So I think, again, we really erred on the side of safety. I talked with my chief of infectious disease. We talked about, there's a hospital in Pittsburgh, I think, that had a fire and they had some contamination of their HVAC system, and they traced some OR infections back to incompletely cleaned HVAC system following that fire. So I'm not smart enough to tell you what the infection was, because that's why I'm not an ID. I'm just a dumb emergency physician. But there are certain risks associated with that, and so we erred on that side of safety and said we're going to take those extra steps. But I really think it would be great to do that work ahead of time to really understand when your HVAC system, what it's capable of handling, and when it does need to be, have what do they call that final cleaning, terminal cleaning. So when do you have to go to that state versus just kind of changing the filters? And so if you know that ahead of time, if you think that through ahead of time, it's going to make your recovery that much easier. And I would really recommend to go through your systems. And again, what are your channels for restocking and supply chain? We had this incredible airlift effort when we were bringing in pallet and truck. It was like D-Day on Normandy Beach. The way they were bringing one truck in and rolling another one and moving these pallets around and just trying to, and we're running around trying to make sure we have all the because the Department of Public Health wasn't going to let us open until every cart had the right equipment on it, right? Every piece of equipment that's supposed to be in that cart was in there, no exceptions. And so, we really had to work hard to make sure, what are we going to steal from one cart to supply the other cart, make sure we have it there. So the tighter your systems are in knowing what's supposed to be in every door and every box and every closet, and knowing how long it's going to get that replaced and where that replacement comes from, is going to help you when you face this situation.
Talk a little bit about some of the conversations you had at the county level. Speak a little more about other conversations that you had during that time, or any help or anything.
So the question is about communication with county EMS, and the various pieces that run a disaster like this. And so I think that night it was really incredibly helpful to have, obviously, fire and law enforcement on scene, and I use those people as a conduit to go back to the incident command in the county. And I think that structure largely worked to get everyone out safely. Although, again, I would emphasize the probably conversations ahead of time about what assets the county is going to have and is going to feel comfortable supplying, right? The whole issue about taking the buses across county lines. And clearly that was the right thing to do, but nobody had thought it through. And then it took us about 45 minutes to bump that up the chain to say, okay, you're good to go. And so that was a little bit of an anxious 45 minutes, but so those kinds of conversations ahead of time probably would pay benefits down the road. Over the next couple of days, one of the areas where we made a little bit of a mistake, I think, was that county was, and Cal Fire really took over running the incident, would have kind of the daily meetings, and you need to send a representative. We weren't consistent in sending a representative to those meetings, and so we were kind of counting on some of that information to flow back to us, and it would eventually. But I think really if we had just taken someone and said, you're the rep, you're going to go stand, at the fairgrounds every day from 9 until noon, sit in these meetings. If any of you have ever sat in those meetings, I've done that internationally. It's a lot of, twiddling your thumbs and listening to people complain and not know where to go. But in the end, a lot of information is disseminated through that route, and that's probably one of the most important things to do, is make sure you assign somebody to attend those meetings. So overall, I would say, it was really remarkable. I mean, there are over 6,000 structures lost, over 5,000 homes. I think in the PowerPoints, it says 40-some people died. I think in the end it was about 50, but I mean, 50 people out of this kind of catastrophe, it's amazing. It's amazing. What people did that night, I don't know. I mean, I heard a story about this couple, very hard of hearing, and weren't wearing their hearing aids, didn't hear the fire, didn't hear the phones, didn't hear the sirens. Woke up the next morning, a little bit smoky, opens his door to get the newspaper, everything's gone. How the fire didn't take them out, I don't know. So these kinds of stories. I mean, the same way my goats. I guess maybe the guy had been chewing down his lawn or something like that. I don't know. So.
A clarification question around the evacuation piece. You mentioned as a loan making that decision. You guys have probably done a fair amount of acknowledgement of authorities and responsibilities for that decision. Was there anything that you had trained on that was really helpful to get to that point, or anything that you wish you had known after the fact that was missing in the authority piece? Actually, big system, big impact.
Yeah. So the question again is about the chain of a command and the sense of authority when you're making the decision to evacuate, and again, how I felt a little bit alone. And yeah, I mean, we worked through the system, and we had by that point, the regional command center was up, and I, of course, told them that's what I was going to do, and they completely supported it because I was the guy on the ground. Just like, I mean, maybe my training as an emergency physician is helpful, right? Those of you who know about EMTALA know that the physician in front of the patient is the one who makes the decision about their need to be transferred, not the person on the receiving end who says, oh, maybe you can put a splint on that and, hold them in the ED for another 12 hours and see if his blood pressure stabilizes. No, I'm telling you, I'm the person in front. So I think there's that kind of training. I think the thing about training is as realistic as you can make it. So I have a friend. We have this great facility with Kaiser Northern California called the Garfield Center. It's a virtual hospital, and they can do all kinds of virtual training, and you can go in there and run kind of the great all the best models with that groan at you when you poke them, and their blood pressure drops, and you can do all the scenarios. And her suggestion is what we all need is some kind of virtual reality glass that you're wearing when you're doing these scenarios, and somebody's running up to you and saying, hey, that patient over there is short of breath, and oh, by the way, your wife just drove in and she's happy to be alive, and somebody else is saying that they got to get home because they have a newborn baby at home. And so it's one thing to do a scenario and take a piece of paper and put it in a chair, and it's another to have real patients. And we're a little bit lucky right now that we have a new building that we're opening up, and it actually just opened last week, but last month it was up and it was, you know, usable as a 3-story building that we could evacuate, and it didn't have actual patients in it. And we took 40 staff members and we had a real, we call it the Evacuation Olympics. And so as much as you can drill those scenarios, and again, I guess the bottom line is just drill evacuation now and again. I mean, we all drill surges all the time, right? We started the conversation talking about that. And even though you guys had this event yesterday, from what I understand, it really took place kind of after the evacuation. It still was handled mostly as a surge event. And so, you know, who in the hospital knows how to pump up the evacuation slides? Who knows how to get a patient onto them? Who knows how to use one of the stairs? The stair chairs are great. They work really well. But by the way, if you have to take 270 patients down on a stair chair, that's not going to happen in 3 hours. You know, that's a day's kind of event. So as much as you can drill it, and as much as you can take a scenario like ours and say, this is what happens in these drills. You know, you're gonna have fire 100 yards off your campus. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? By the way, someone's calling right now. By the way, fire's coming through and saying we're making a last stand. You know, what are you going to do now? Because obviously, the more you train these things, the more you practice them, the easier they are in the moment. And that's the bottom line.
Can you tell me how many critical care patients that you have, you know, on bed, and do you make a heavy lift as far as getting them out? And what?
So the question was about critical patients, how many were on the vent, how many were in the ICU, and what did it take to get them out. And we were extremely lucky. Now, we're not a big hospital. Like I said, we typically run an ICU census of around 6 to 8. It can go up to 12 or 13. That night it was 4 and only 1 on the vent. So we were really lucky. Just like the people who woke up not hearing the fire, there's a lot of luck involved. But, you know, the ICU staff, very dedicated to their patients. That's the opening photo, is the one patient was on the phone, on the vent, very dramatic photo, went international. But we kind of said, who do you need? And this is, you know, part of what you're doing as the incident commander. What do you need? How many hands do you need to get up there? Okay, we'll send another couple nurses from the ED to help move patients down. Again, had we not had power to run the elevators, a very different decision. And maybe we would have decided to keep those patients there, although they would have had to come down eventually. But having elevators was a slightly easier decision to say, okay, we're going to put them, just roll the gurney into the elevator and take them down. And you know, you need 3, 4, 5 people because someone's got to be bagging and those things. And again, having the ambulances on scene. Now, we have engaged a dispatch system, and I have to admit, I don't know as much about it because it was happening kind of in the background, but part of the reason that we were able to get 20 ambulances on scene is because of this system that they use to coordinate. I think it's called vector care or something like that. And I actually only just recently learned about it. I said, oh, tell me more. I didn't even know we were using it that night. And again, the vast majority of our patients went in buses and private vehicles, but we did get 20 ambulances on scene. And so the ability to kind of coordinate those ambulances. So again, this company that does this is actually using Kaiser Santa Rosa as an example and saying, on average, it takes 4 minutes a patient to get people out, and Kaiser Santa Rosa did it in 40 seconds a patient. And so, having those ambulances on scene, so whatever you can do to coordinate that care ahead of time, thinking about what your resources in the county, and that's what, you know, that's what EMS does. That's what the county EOC is going to be doing in those opportunities. But thinking about what your resources are, you know, because obviously you know, we have our public or county EMS system, but then we have private transport companies too. Like for us, it's Falcon are 2 providers. We engage them all the time for transports as opposed to EMS response, but they're also there to be brought in these situations.
For emergency preparedness and contingency planning, as the fall of war has settled, have you guys gone back and taken a look at those plans to see what you could have incorporated? More importantly, have you looked at the plans to see, wow, if we would have followed the plans, we would have probably seen the check marks that we had built into the system prior to maybe shutting the HVAC system off before you locked the doors after the week?
So the question is about hot wash and what you do afterwards to kind of evaluate, review, and look down through the plans and see, did you follow the plans as they were written, and what would you change about the plans? And the answer is yes. I mean, it's ongoing still today that we're still doing some debriefs and walking through things. It's interesting right now because we're because we're in a stage for our EMS that the contract is up for renewal, so they're kind of going through it in that regard too. I can't speak to the specifics about what the county has decided around changing, but again, as a hospital system, as we walk through it, some of those things that we talked about in terms of assigning someone as a patient tracker, making sure that we have that information, thinking about being able to print off patient information. In fact, now we're going to try to look to move to a system where at least once a shift, somebody is kind of organizing who's on the floor and what would it take to print out those patient evacuation sheets. So there's some things along those nature. But did it maintain structural stability or did that collapse? So the question is, did the cell system stay up and running? And it did. It was overwhelmed, obviously, as they are in those times. But by and large, it did. Like I said, my neighbor called me, and I was able to call my wife, and so by and large, we were able to communicate through cell phones. I'm not aware of any significant outages or blockages that occurred. So.
From a regulatory standpoint, did you have any issues afterwards with the 1135 waiver or Medicaid?
So the question is about regulatory barriers and the 1135, and I can't speak specifically to 1135. I can tell you that our primary barrier was working with the Department of Public Health, who operate under those systems, and their concerns to make sure that we had everything in place. Just so, in other words, my feeling was like, hey, this community needs the hospital back open. Can't we just open the doors? Yeah, I can't tell you if every crash cart has the 3 doses of epinephrine that are supposed to be there, but I can get by without it, you know. And so, but they weren't interested in playing that game. So, but you know, I understand where they're coming from too. So, but one of the things that I've talked to with the California Hospital Association is maybe a more standard understanding of what is required in this situation. So, right, we all know that in a disaster, right, there's regulations are loosened, as they should be. And so, but I think there was understanding of that in the moment and maybe in the first 48 hours. But as we moved into the 10-day and 2-week phase, I think there was less relaxation of those. And again, from my perspective as an emergency physician, as a doctor, wanting to be able to provide care to the community, I want my hospital back open. And I felt like I could handle 99.99999% of what was going to come in without making sure that every T was crossed and every I dotted. But at that point, there's like, nope, we're back to our regular. So I think a hospital association has the ability to work on that. And I have actually brought that up to the California Hospital Association. So the question is, did we send patients to non-Kaiser facilities? And the answer is absolutely yes. Santa Rosa Memorial took our critical patients, and Petaluma Valley, which is just a little bit further south, took some of our critical patients. But I wanted to keep them within the system in large part because I didn't want to overwhelm Santa Rosa Memorial. I mean, Santa Rosa Memorial now, remember I mentioned Sutter was already evacuated. Now we're evacuating. They're like the last man standing. And we're in the middle of a disaster where they're getting, even if we hadn't sent patients to them, they were being overwhelmed. So the idea was really to try to manage the community and send them only those patients that we had to. Now we have patients go there all the time because we're not a trauma center and Santa Rosa Memorial is. So EMS brings trauma patients to them routinely. We also have our county, as yours probably does too, has a 12 lead in the field program. So STEMIs go to Memorial or to Sutter because we don't have a cath lab. So that's routine for us to have patients over there. There's a lot of coordination. I would say the coordination that really occurred was after the fire and restocking the hospital. That partnership that occurred and really the kind of community approach to not that, oh, there's Sutter or that's Memorial and that's Kaiser. No, we're a community that's providing care to the 500,000 people in this area. And so what equipment do you have that you can send to us? And what equipment how can we help you out? And what physicians and nurses do you need over at Memorial? We sent staff over there. So that's really the partnering that occurs in those situations. I don't know what time I have until I'm probably running over. Okay, keep going. All right.
Obviously very traumatic. I'm wondering how your wife and daughter are doing, but could you also speak to efforts that are still ongoing to deal with those kind of issues?
So the question was about the impact to my own personal family and then the efforts, I think, of the organization to support that. And yeah, it's been traumatic. I mean, I can just speak personally that I feel like my past was erased because I lost pretty much everything. Now I have some photos on the cloud, but I had a trunk of photos. that I kept saying, oh, I got to digitize these. You know, my dad, my cousin, you know, my dad's generation, none of that stuff's on the cloud. Not digitized. I lost it all, you know. The love letters that I wrote to my wife. I had proof that I was the world's best dad. My kids wrote it often. It's gone. Actually, my daughter just wrote me, as she graduated from college, she wrote me a card that said, "You're the best dad." But so I'm regaining some of that proof. But and I got to tell you too, the other part of that is you know, dealing with insurance. I meant to mention this before. You know, you have to, when you're going to put in a claim, you have to account for every pair of underpants, every, you know, lip balm, every record, CD. Now they're listening to that a little bit, but it is an ordeal, and it's traumatic because you're listening through your life, everything that you got to think of. I really missed that, you know, that you hadn't thought about. So pull out your device when you go home tonight and spend 10 minutes walking around your house and just videotaping things, and then over the next 6 months or a year, maybe just set aside 2 hours once a month to go through and try to catalog some of the things you have. It will save you so much grief as you try to deal with that. It's really a hassle to deal with that. On top of, now I've got to deal with finding an architect, finding a builder. Oh, here's the other thing. How well do you understand your insurance policy? I'm going to guess probably not so well. We all have a two-page declaration page that says what you're covered for, but there's a 60-page document that lives behind it that really puts the details. Like, do you have, right, it says your house and structure is covered for X number, $100,000, $200,000. There's also an extension that lives behind that. So that says if it actually costs, you know, if we're estimating it's going to cost $150 a square foot to rebuild your house, $600 in Sonoma County right now, then you're covered for up to 50% over that, or 25%, or none. So these are extensions that live in the back of your policy. And by the way, some policies actually have a clause about if it's a disaster area, that you'll get 100% extension. But not every policy has that. Turns out my policy doesn't have that. That's why so many people are showing up with this gap in the coverage. So I'll say that about you know, preparedness and the stress that you go through. I think my wife and I were married 26 years, and I've gone through a lot together. She's put up with me doing Ironman training and sailing and doing all these things. Actually, one of her best lines was in 2001. I had an opportunity to go sail for 6 weeks in the South Pacific, and she said, "I'm not telling you what decision to make. I only hope you make the right decision." So I didn't go on that trip. So I mean, I think we've been very fortunate that we're there for each other, but like I said, not some people have gone, you know, it's gone sideways. For my daughter, you know, she's a 16-year-old, and we forced her to go into therapy, and finally her therapist said, "This is just 16-year-old angst. There's nothing more there. She doesn't seem to be struggling," but she does not like to talk about the fire. You know, someone came, they're doing an oral history about the fire, and they came and they interviewed my wife and me, and there were 2 events going on that day. It was going to be a fundraising event for the free clinic where I'm the medical director, and then someone's going to come interview us. And I said, "You have to do one. I don't care which one, but you got to do one." And she didn't want to go to the fundraiser, so she stuck around for the oral history. But I said, "You don't have to speak." And so, but for the first 5 minutes, she watched, and then she just disappeared. She doesn't want to deal with that. For my wife, I mentioned, you know, the loss of the pets and our connection to our dogs. And one of the toughest things that we have had to go through is that we have an older dog and a 3-year-old dog, had a 3-year-old dog. And they both did okay in the fire, but I mentioned we moved a lot. In our old house, nobody ever walked by because we're up on this hill. There's only one neighbor above us, although my dog did manage to get hit by the neighbor. But he, you know, but he's a sweet dog, pound puppy. He just started getting much more territorial with every move. And in the house we live now, there's people who walk by every day with their dogs. And about 4 weeks ago, a neighbor was walking by, and my wife and I were out at a school event. My daughter was home with the dog. The dog jumped over a gate in the kitchen. He knows how to spin the lock open on the door, pulled the door open, charged outside, and took down the neighbor's dog. And I linked that directly to the fire and the stress that he obviously was feeling. And when, you know, my own feeling was, my wife's a veterinarian, and we talked to behavioralists. And, you know, once the genie's out of the bottle, you're not going to put it back in. I said, I can't risk that, you know, the 8-year-old boy is going to be walking by with his new puppy I can't risk that. And so we had to put the dog down, and that was heartbreaking. And that was the first time my wife said, maybe we should just leave. That was the first time. So it goes on, and it goes on for a long while. It's not just the week after the fire, or it's like that young woman said, it's not going to be normal for us for a long time. I would say that my organization has continued to be very supportive of that, recognizing that people need time, whether it's for therapy or whether it's just a reduced work schedule or whether it's financial support. And my colleagues have pitched in with offered time and offered money. And so as an organization, I think there's an ongoing recognition there, very much keeping it alive, part of it is banding together in your tribe, right? I don't know if you ever, what's that book called, Tribal Leadership? And we all live in our tribes. I mean, emergency department is one of the most rooted tribes there is out there. But now we have this tribe of fire survivors. And so we get together once a month for lunches. Sometimes it's just to where are you at in the rebuilding process? Have you found the builder? How's the bank things working? And sometimes it's about something specific that the organization is doing. So whether it's a loan program or whether it's trying to pull us all together, maybe leverage that group. So they're continuing to do that.
Obviously, you guys had staff that had some of those things, their houses are burned down, anyway, where do I put my kids, that sort of thing. How did you guys manage the need for staff in the building to treat people, when maybe be understaffed, but how did you help them? What some of the things you did there?
So it's a great question, and it's a classic thing about how do you deal with daycare and managing the needs of families under a disaster, whether it's a fire disaster or a flood or power outages or a hurricane or whatever your disaster is. There are always people who are affected, and their first worry is about their families. How are they going to take care of whether it's an elderly parent or whether it's their kid? And by the way, the schools are closed, right? That's what most of us do for daycare is we send our kids to school. And so now the schools are closed, and so what are you going to do about that? And so we set up daycare in the hospital, right? So once our facilities, the first thing we were able to do was open up the clinics. And so I would say, let me back up a little bit. For the first, 48, 72 hours, we really were very limited on what we were offering for services. We had some people on the phone. We had some people who were staffing some of the other facilities or some of the other outlying clinics, but it was a fraction of our normal operations. And so in that time, it was fine for people. The people who were able came in and did that. The people who had daycare or family duties or responsibilities, they took care of that, and there was no pressure. Once we were able to open up the clinics back up, which came at about day 7 or 8, I think, then there was much more of a demand for staff. And so we had to think about daycare as part of that. And absolutely, that's got to be a part of any disaster plan, is how you're going to provide daycare. And so, we hire professional daycare people to come in, and it was marginally utilized. In the end, people find other things to do with, in a disaster by day 7, people have moved their kids down to their in-laws or done all those other things that they do. But absolutely has to be part of a plan to provide daycare. So I've run over. I hope that was useful. And thanks for having me up here. So.
Thank you very much. So I can take my jacket off.
Yeah, now you can take your jacket off. You can relax. That was incredibly inspiring and motivating to hear from those lessons learned to help us do the work that we're doing here in our region. So thank you for taking the time to come up and share your story with us today. I think it will go a long ways with what we're doing and help us facilitate the work that we're doing.